Jesus continues to confound death and nullify the effects of impurity. What do these two stories about the healing of women tell us about the ministry and identity of Jesus? Greetings and welcome to the Bible Paladin as we continue chapter 5 of Mark's Gospel. For context, last time we talked about how Jesus, after a long day of preaching, set out across the sea with his disciples to Gentile territory. During that time there was a great storm, and Jesus rebuked the wind and calmed the storm. And then they arrived, and Jesus cast out a legion of demons who promptly flew into a herd of swine who ran across the cliff and drowned in the sea.
When pigs fly.
Right. It was a crazy event. And so Jesus and the disciples get back in the boat and return to Capernaum, where we'll hear more stories of Jesus and his authority over that which is unclean. We'll hear about the great story of how he cures a young girl. But this is interrupted by another woman who is also seeking the healing power of Jesus. Again, Mark uses the sandwich or interpolation storytelling technique, which will highlight these two miracle stories and teach us something about Jesus and the gospel. And so we begin with verse 21 as we listen to these healing miracles. So we pray for the guidance of the Holy Spirit as we read the sacred word. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her, so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. In the context of the broader gospel, as well as in the parallel stories in which we hear about this account, it seems that Jesus has returned to the area around Capernaum, if not the city itself. And this kind of becomes Jesus' base of operation. Also, it seems that most likely Peter and Andrew and James and John probably lived in or around Capernaum. And as usual in Mark's gospel, we see that the crowds have gathered around Jesus. But we also hear about Jairus, a synagogue leader. Now, this is unusual for a couple of reasons. Up until this point, many of the Jewish leaders had been in opposition to Jesus, his teachings, and his style. Yet this synagogue leader not only approached Jesus, but fell at his feet. We are rarely told the names of the people that Jesus heals, so there must be a reason that Mark mentions it. Considering that a number of the apostles were from this area and would have attended synagogue here, there is a good chance that Jairus would have been known to them. There is also a good chance that he and possibly a good number of his congregation would have ended up as Christians, many of them probably known to Mark and the early church. As we look at what he does and what he asks of Jesus, there are a number of words and expressions that we will hear throughout these verses and that become quite significant in these stories. He fell at his feet. He says his daughter is dying. He asks Jesus to put his hands on her. And he believes that Jesus will heal her so that she will live. Jesus says nothing at this point, but he does begin to follow Jairus. And so we too, as the readers, will also follow them, but then we are interrupted. So let us read on to hear what happens. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered. "And yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." We are now introduced to a woman who had been bleeding or hemorrhaging for the past 12 years. And considering this uniquely female condition, it most likely would have happened when she was about 12 years old. And it's interesting that Mark describes this condition that she was suffering at the hands of doctors for all of this time. And some of us may be able to relate. Anyone who may have a chronic or continual illness and who goes in and out of doctor's offices just trying to find some sort of relief, and nobody seems to know what to do or what medications to prescribe, we may understand what she was going through. And imagine back then when science and healthcare was much more rudimentary. Another aspect of the story that is worth noting is that due to her condition, this would have made her impure or unclean, meaning that she could not touch or be touched by anyone else for fear of making them unclean as well. So this would severely limit her options both economically, religiously, and socially as a Jewish woman. But she has faith. Not only faith in God, but in Jesus, this mysterious teacher and healer. And just like Jairus, she reasons the same way. He said, "If you put your hands on her, she will live." And she says, "If I touch him, I will be healed." And of course, this is exactly what happens to her. And Jesus quickly turns around and asks what seems like an insane question. He says, "Who touched me?" Of course, his disciples are like, "Jesus, there's literally hundreds of people touching you. What are you saying?" But Jesus doubles down and then he looks around. The crowd most likely got very quiet, wondering what was going on. And then Jesus sees the woman. Now, if you've ever been to an event where a person of significance was present, like a celebrity or a religious person, there does seem to be this weird fascination or this desire for people to want to touch them. Perhaps they think that some of their popularity, talent, or holiness will rub off on them, or maybe just bragging rights. But here, the woman really believed in the power of Jesus and that he had healing power, that the power was part of his being. And she wasn't wrong. She may have not fully understood how it worked, but she had faith, and that faith was enough. Now, based on his reaction, you might ask, did Jesus intend to heal her? And the gospel doesn't make it clear. It says that he realized that power went out of him, but it really doesn't say whether he consented to the act. And this really begs the question of the nature of Jesus. Now, some would argue that because he was fully divine, of course he meant to heal her. In fact, he would have known her before she even approached him, and his desire all along was to heal her. There are others who would say, well, because of his human nature, perhaps he didn't realize that she came, but he did realize that the power came out of him, knowing that this was part of who he was, but not knowing all of the details because he fully emptied himself to experience the human condition. For example, you might say that Jesus learned and grew and knew certain languages that he would have growing up in the area, like Aramaic, Hebrew, and possibly Greek, but he wouldn't have known Chinese or French. So in this instance, could have he known that power went out of him, but it caught him off guard? Perhaps this analogy might help. In the Old Testament, the Israelites believed that God dwelt with them in the Ark of the Covenant. I mean, it wasn't an incarnate presence like with Jesus, but there was a presence that they took very seriously, and the Ark itself was seen as something very powerful.
There's a picture of it right here.
Good God.
Yes, that's just what the Hebrews thought.
Now, what's that supposed to be coming out of there?
Lightning. Fire. Power of God or something.
The Bible speaks of the ark leveling mountains and laying waste to entire regions. An army which carries the ark before it is invincible.
Right. I mean, in fact, there's a story in 1 Samuel chapter 6 when they are carrying the ark and Uzzah reaches up to touch the ark because one of the oxen carrying it stumbled, and he is struck down and dies right at that instant. So simply touching the ark would bring God's power and wrath. They would also sacrifice offerings before the ark, and there were many rules about who could even enter into its presence because of how holy and powerful it was. Now, Jesus is greater than the ark, and we've already seen a number of times in Mark's gospel how Jesus is described as one in whom the Spirit of God dwells, and similar language is used to speak about the ark. And yet when this woman approaches and touches Jesus, she is not struck down like Uzzah, but the opposite happens. Life is given to her. Jesus is ushering in a new kingdom, one in which he is bringing life, not death. He is showing that one need not fear God, but rather can approach him. Even the unclean can enter into his presence, which was unheard of under the old covenant. So of course, when the woman realizes what happened, she trembles with fear because she realizes that she is in the presence of God. Just like the apostles trembled with fear after Jesus calmed the storm. And so she does the same thing, and yet she falls at his feet and, as it says, tells him the whole truth. Compare this to Eve, who hid from God when he came looking, and then tried to blame someone else for her action. No, this woman honors her Lord and speaks to him without deceit. And he calls her daughter. It might seem odd to the crowds, but just as God called Eve his daughter, Jesus calls this woman daughter, even though physically they would have been close in age. He explains that it was her faith that healed her, and tells her to go in peace and to suffer no more. This healing has given her new life in so many ways. She can now participate in society for the first time since her childhood. Now, with this beautiful story concluded, we are reminded of where Jesus was going when he was interrupted. So let's continue the story. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. So between the crowds and the healing of this other woman, it seems that Jesus didn't get to Jairus' house quick enough. For all of his servants come and tell him that his daughter has died, and he doesn't need to bother the teacher anymore. Well, Jesus overhears this conversation and then interrupts them, saying, "Don't worry about it. I just need you to believe." In other words, he's telling him to act just as the other woman had acted, who believed, who was not afraid to touch Jesus because of her faith. And now he is asking Jairus to do the same. And here's where things get interesting. Jesus calls 3 from the 12 he had already chosen: Peter, James, and John. It is interesting that Mark reminds us that this was John, the brother of James. Tradition holds that James was martyred in AD 44, so his memory would have been fresh in the minds of Christians and perhaps more well-known than that of John, who had yet to write his gospel. Here we also see the first mention of these particular 3 apostles who had kind of become the inner circle with Jesus. They seemed to witness a few of the things and miracles of Jesus that the other apostles would not. Jesus may have trusted them a little bit more. He wanted them to witness this particular miracle, but also trusted them to keep it quiet. Apparently, the house of Jairus was a good distance away, or his family was certainly not expecting the girl to live, because we already have people crying and wailing, possibly even paid mourners, who were a thing back then, particularly those for a higher status, like a synagogue leader. When Jesus says that the child is not dead, he is laughed at. But perhaps he tells the crowds outside that so that they will begin to entertain a little bit of doubt and not realize the full extent of the miracle, because the girl is in fact dead. So he limits the crowd even further, allowing only the child's father and mother and the 3 disciples into the room. He takes her hand. Again, the theme of touching the one who is to be healed, and he speaks to her. He says these words in Aramaic, which are recorded along with its translation into Greek. We, of course, have the Greek translated to English. And I like to think that this was a very impactful story for Peter when he recounted it to Mark. He must have been very specific about the details, even emphasizing the exact words that Jesus spoke. We are told that this girl immediately gets up and begins to walk around. She is not only brought back to life, but whatever ailment she had is completely cured. We are also told that she was 12 years old, the age that the other woman probably was when she had contracted her ailment, and the one who had been suffering for 12 years. So this young girl is just beginning her life. She may even be preparing to be betrothed. So Jesus is giving her a second chance at life. The last verse provides some details that ground the story not only in the gospel, but also in reality. Of course, Jesus tells the disciples and the family not to tell anybody, because this would put the path to his own death at an early start, and Jesus isn't ready at this point in his ministry for that. But there's something else that he says that I think grounds the story. He tells them to give her something to eat.
Why won't my arms move?
You've been mostly dead all day.
She's been dead for a while and needs her strength. It also shows that the miracles of Jesus take into account the whole person. Jesus is not just a teacher, as he is called, but also the divine physician. So what can be learned from these stories? And I find them to be incredible and inspirational stories about faith and hope. For these individuals and these families, they believed that there was no hope for them. For the woman that we hear about, she had very few options left in life. She was dealing daily with her affliction. Jairus and his family were about to lose their daughter, and by coming to Jesus, Jairus was risking his career and reputation. But they had faith. They believed that the only one that could save them was Jesus, despite the risk. And the faith of this woman was really the key to understanding these stories. While Jairus was a known person in the area and was able to gain the attention of Jesus even in the midst of the crowd, the unnamed and unclean woman would have not gotten such an opportunity if it wasn't for her courage brought on by her faith. What this might tell us is that regardless of what we think our status is or how unworthy we might be, Jesus is ready to drop everything and listen to our plea. Our status or gender or wealth makes no difference. And that's a pretty good example of how followers of Jesus should probably be as well. Thank you so much for watching, and please share your thoughts on these beautiful stories below. Have you ever encountered God in such a way? Or have you ever been at some place in your life where you felt discouraged and that there was no hope? What has your experience been like? I'd love to hear from you. And so please join me next time as we continue to hear about the stories of Jesus in which he is himself rejected and discouraged. So until next time, keep reading the Bible, and God bless. Wait, before you go, I just want to share with you a product that is really helpful if you want to study and read the Bible. And if you really do want to study and get deeper into the Bible, which I know you do because you've stayed to the end of this video, you're really going to like this product. It's called Logos Bible Software. There are some links in this description if you want to begin your journey with Logos. And if you do order from one of these links, you'll get a lot of deals and maybe some free books, and it'll also help this channel. So thank you so much, and God bless.